on a road that led away from everything he had ever owned. A man who had once commanded armies of shadows hit the brakes so hard his German shepherd lurched against the dash. Because through the whiteout, he saw something no man of his kind was ever supposed to witness. A widow, clutching a newborn to her chest like the child was the last warm thing left in the world. Two older children stumbling behind her, their thin coats doing nothing against the blizzard, small bodies bent sideways into the wind, footprints already swallowed by the snow. He had given up his empire that morning, signed it away with a steady hand and driven north, intending never to stop. But he stopped. She didn't beg, didn't scream, didn't even look up when his headlights found her. She just kept walking, head down, jaw set, as if surviving wasn't a choice anymore. As if it was simply the next punishment in a long line of punishments she had learned to carry without complaint. He stepped out into the storm. Wind tore at his black coat. Snow caught in the silver of his signet ring, the same ring she would later recognize, the same ring that would unravel everything. And he said the only words left in him, "Come with me. No one survives alone." Before we see whether she takes his hand, tell us where you're watching from. And if a story about the darkest kind of man finding the quietest kind of redemption is something that moves you, stay close. Because this one doesn't end where you think it does. The G-Wagon moved through the blizzard like a black wound cutting through white silence. Brad kept both hands on the wheel and said nothing. The dog, Rex, had already made his decision about the strangers, resting his broad head on the little girl's knee as if he'd known her for years. The boy sat rigid against the door, watching Brad the way prey watches something it cannot outrun. The woman, Alice, held the newborn against her collarbone and stared through the windshield at the wall of snow the headlights couldn't fully penetrate. Nobody asked where they were going. Nobody had the strength to. The retreat was 40 minutes off the main road. A ranch house pressed low against a ridge of pines, built to disappear. Brad had purchased it 18 months ago under a name that wasn't his, for exactly the life he had planned to live alone. He pulled into the covered garage and killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, listening to the wind throw itself against the walls outside. He carried the children's bag. Alice carried the baby and walked without being told. Inside, he lit the wood stove without ceremony and found the emergency blankets stacked on the shelf where he'd left them, still in their packaging. He set water to boil. He pulled a wool throw from the chest by the window and handed it to Alice without making eye contact, because something in her expression, that hollow, practiced endurance, made looking at her directly feel like an intrusion. The older children ate canned soup sitting on the floor in front of the stove like it was the finest meal they'd ever been given. Maybe it was. Brad stood in the kitchen doorway with his coffee and watched the fire catch and hold. He had told himself this house would be a place of emptiness. Quiet rooms for a quiet ending to a loud life. No names, no debts, no faces looking to him for answers. But the baby made a small sound from the blanket pile on the couch. Not a cry, just a breath, a declaration of continued existence. And Rex lifted his head and looked at Brad as if to say, well, the storm pressed against the windows all night. Nobody left. 3 days passed before Alice spoke more than necessity. She asked where he kept the extra wood. She asked if Rex was allowed on the furniture. Small questions with practical edges, nothing that required him to look at her life too closely or her to look at his. Brad answered and moved away and gave her the only thing he suspected no one had given her in a long time, room. But on the 4th morning he came downstairs before dawn and found her standing at the kitchen window, burning something small in a clay dish she must have carried in the bottom of that worn bag. The smoke rose thin and silver in the dark, and the smell of it, dry and ancient, like the earth before the snow, moved through the room and settled into everything. Sage. She didn't startle when she heard him, just tilted her head slightly, the way people do when they've learned that sudden movements attract the wrong kind of attention. "My grandmother taught me," she said without turning. "You burn it to clear what the night leaves behind." He poured his coffee and said nothing, but he didn't leave either. That became its own kind of language between them. Him staying, her not asking him to go. She was Lakota on her mother's side. She told him this on the 6th day, matter-of-factly, the way she said most things, as if offering a fact rather than an intimacy. She braided her daughter's hair each morning with a quiet concentration that made the whole house feel steadier. She sang to the baby in a language Brad didn't know, low and rhythmic, and the sound of it moved through the walls like the stove's heat, present without announcing itself. He found himself pausing in doorways. Not watching, he was careful about that, but aware. The way a man becomes aware of a fire after years of living in the cold. She laughed once, on the 7th night, at something her son said at the table. It was brief and unguarded and clearly surprised her as much as it surprised the room. She pressed her fingers to her lips as if catching it. Brad looked down at his plate. Something he had not used in years shifted quietly behind his ribs, and he did not name it. It was the boy who noticed first. Brad had left his gloves by the sink after splitting wood, and when he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he caught the boy, Daniel, 8 years old, with his mother's careful eyes, staring at his right hand with an expression too old for his face. Brad said nothing, pulled his gloves back on. But that evening, Alice was helping him carry the supply boxes from the garage shelf, and he reached past her to lift the heavier crate, and his sleeve rode up, glove slipping back at the wrist, and the ring caught the overhead light the way it always did, silver, heavy, the crest pressed deep into the metal. A wolf's head above 2 crossed keys. Alice went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of recognition. Brad set the crate down and watched her face move through something he had seen before, in interrogation rooms, in the moments before men decided whether to run or confess. She was doing arithmetic. Rapid, terrible arithmetic. "Where did you get that ring?" she said. Not a question. Her voice had dropped to something flat and careful, the way voices go when the body is managing something the mind hasn't fully accepted yet. "It was given to me," Brad said. "By who?" He looked at her. She looked at the ring. And in the silence between them the answer assembled itself without his help, because she was already there, already at the conclusion. Her hand braced against the garage shelf and her knuckles going white. "They told me it was a car accident," she said. "Marcus. 3 years ago. Black ice on the interstate." She finally lifted her eyes to his. "There was a ring like that in the photographs. Evidence the police said meant nothing. Evidence that disappeared." Brad did not look away. He could have lied. He had lied to better men in worse rooms than this, and they had believed him completely. The machinery for it was still there, well-oiled and ready. But she was looking at him the way his mother had looked at him, once, a long time ago, like she already knew the shape of the truth and was simply waiting to see what kind of man he was going to be about it. He said nothing, which was, in its own way, everything. She didn't scream, didn't throw anything, didn't take the children and barricade herself in the back room the way he half expected and would have understood completely. She walked outside. He gave her 20 minutes, watching through the kitchen window as she stood at the edge of the tree line in her coat, her back to the house, the sage-gray sky pressing down on everything. Then he pulled on his jacket and followed, because the temperature was dropping and she was not the kind of woman who would come back in simply because her body demanded it. He stopped a few feet behind her. His name was Marcus Reyes, Brad said. He ran money for us through a logistics front in Billings. When he decided to stop, my brother sent 2 men to persuade him. He paused. They were more persuasive than I authorized. The wind moved through the pines above them. I didn't order it, he said, but I built the organization that made it possible. I set the conditions, and when I found out, I buried it because exposing it would have exposed everything else. 20 years of everything else. Alice's breath came out in a slow cloud. He called me that morning, she said quietly. Before it happened, he said he was done, that we were leaving, that he'd found a way out. She stopped. Emma was 6 weeks old. Brad absorbed that, let it sit where it deserved to sit, without flinching away from the weight of it. I've been telling myself for years, he said, that stepping away was enough, that handing it off and walking north made the ledger balance somehow. He looked at his gloved hand, at the shape of the ring beneath the leather. It doesn't. I know that now. Standing here, I know that. She turned then. Her face was not soft and it was not forgiving. It was clear, the way faces get when every illusion has finally been stripped away by cold and truth and exhaustion. Why did you stop? She asked. On the road. You didn't know us. You could have driven past. He thought about lying, about something clean and heroic. Rex saw you first, he said, and I've been trying, for a long time, to become the kind of man who listens to his dog. She almost laughed. Almost. It was enough. He came on a Tuesday, which was exactly the kind of thing Vincent would do. Not a weekend when the gesture might feel dramatic. A Tuesday, gray, ordinary, unremarkable, because Vincent had always understood that real power doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives and rearranges the furniture. Brad heard the truck before he saw it. That particular engine note, low and expensive, coming up the access road through the pines. Rex heard it too and stood from his place by the stove without being told, moving to the door with his shoulders forward and his ears flat. Brad put his hand on the dog's back and looked at Alice across the kitchen. She had heard it as well. Her hands had stopped moving over the dough she was kneading and she was very still, the way she went still when something triggered the part of her that had learned, over 3 hard years, to read the quality of approaching danger. Take the children to the back bedroom, Brad said. Lock it from inside. She didn't argue. That frightened him more than anything else could have. Vincent stepped out of the black truck in a charcoal overcoat, his shoes wrong for the snow and not caring, because men like Vincent made the environment accommodate them rather than the other way around. He was 3 years younger than Brad, broader across the chest, and he wore the authority of the organization the way their father had, like a second skeleton, load-bearing and invisible. He looked at the ranch house. He looked at Brad on the porch. He smiled the smile that had never once reached his eyes in 41 years of life. You look domestic, Vincent said. You look lost, Brad said. This road isn't on any map. Vincent stopped at the base of the porch steps, hands easy at his sides, and tilted his head in that particular way that meant the pleasantries were already finished. The woman, her husband borrowed from us and died before the debt cleared. That obligation transferred. You know how this works, Brad, you wrote the policy. I retired. From leadership. Vincent's eyes moved briefly to the house, to the curtained window where Brad knew Daniel was almost certainly watching. Not from consequence. The wind came through the pines. Rex growled, low and continuous, like an engine that had already made its decision. Sheriff Dale Pruitt had known Brad for 11 months. Long enough to understand that the man who'd bought the Hendricks Ranch and paid his property taxes early and waved from his truck on the county road was not entirely what he appeared to be, and short enough to have decided, pragmatically, that this was not his problem. Brad called him 20 minutes after Vincent's truck disappeared back down the access road. No preamble, no performance, just the facts arranged in the order a practical man needed to hear them, with two things left deliberately unspoken: the full name of the organization involved, and the number of bodies historically connected to it. Some information was a gift, some was a burden. Brad had always known the difference. Pruitt arrived at dusk in a county truck with a cracked windshield and a demeanor that suggested he had long ago made his peace with the gap between the law as written and the law as livable. He was 60-something, weathered the way fence posts get weathered, not weakened, just stripped of everything unnecessary. He sat at Brad's kitchen table and drank his coffee and listened without interrupting, which was the mark of either a very good lawman or a very tired one. Probably both. "I can't arrest a man for driving up a private road," Pruitt said when Brad finished. "I know that. And if the debt's documented, civil courts get complicated." "I know that too." Pruitt looked at his cup. "What exactly is it you're asking me for, son?" "Presence," Brad said. "Visibility. A patrol car on the county road twice a day. His people understand optics. A sheriff's attention makes the property expensive. They'll look for easier solutions elsewhere while I work the problem from my end." Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. Through the wall, barely audible, Alice was singing to the baby. That low, rhythmic Lakota cadence that had become, without Brad quite noticing, the sound the house made when it was at peace. Pruitt heard it too. Something moved across his worn face. "My wife left me 11 years ago," he said, for no apparent reason. Then he stood, settled his hat, and picked up his keys. "Patrol starts tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. He didn't wait to be thanked. Brad stood at the window and watched his taillights dissolve into the dark, and felt, for the first time in days, that the walls of the house were holding. He started before sunrise. The work was physical and deliberate, the kind Brad had always trusted more than conversation. He rehung the garage door with a heavier track and a deadbolt mechanism that required a code. He ran new cable along the tree line, mounting the cameras at angles that covered the blind spots he'd identified the morning after Vincent left, walking the perimeter in the dark with Rex at his side, thinking the way he used to think before operations. Threat vectors, sight lines, the geometry of vulnerability. By the second day, Daniel was following him, not asking questions, just appearing at the edge of whatever Brad was doing, hands in his pockets, watching with those careful eyes. Brad let him watch. On the third morning, he handed the boy a spare flashlight and said, "Hold that steady on the bracket." And Daniel held it steady without being asked twice. They worked like that for a while, quietly, the way men work when they are figuring each other out through the task rather than through words. "What are we doing?" Daniel asked eventually. "Making the house harder to surprise," Brad said. Daniel thought about this with the seriousness of someone who had already been surprised too many times. Like a fort. Like a fort. He taught them other things in the days that followed. Not combat, nothing that would haunt them, but the practical grammar of awareness. He showed Daniel how the pines on the north ridge bent before a weather change, how Rex's ears moved differently for wind sounds versus footstep sounds. He showed the girl, Maya, 6, who processed everything through fierce and watchful silence, how to count seconds between the motion sensor light triggering and the sound of the alert inside, so she'd know whether something was close or at the tree line. He framed it all as games. They were not games. Alice watched from the porch one afternoon, arms folded against the cold, as Brad crouched in the snow beside Daniel, both of them studying the ridge. She said nothing when Brad came back inside, just handed him a cup of coffee and let her fingers rest briefly on his forearm. A fraction of a second, barely anything. But he felt it for the rest of the day in the way the ranch felt different now. Less like a hiding place, more like something worth defending. They came on a Thursday. 3 trucks. No headlights. Brad knew because Rex woke him at 4 a.m. with a silence more alarming than any growl. That absolute, held-breath stillness that meant the dog had already assessed the situation and was waiting for instructions. Brad was dressed and downstairs in 90 seconds. He'd laid the contingency out mentally 100 times since Vincent's visit. The sequence, the timing, the single phone call that had to happen before anything else. He made it now, standing in the dark kitchen, voice low, to a number he had not dialed in 14 months. A man in Chicago who owed Brad a debt significant enough that it had never been discussed aloud, only understood. He said 4 sentences. The man on the other end said 2. Then Brad woke Alice. She took in his expression and didn't ask questions, just moved to the children with that economy of motion she had, that complete absence of wasted energy, and had them in the back room with the door locked in under a minute. He had come to understand, the most quietly competent person he had ever known. Vincent came to the front door rather than through it, which meant he still believed in the architecture of negotiation. Brad respected that enough to open it. His brother stood in the porch light with 2 men behind him and the trucks idling at the tree line. He looked at Brad's face and whatever he found there made him recalibrate, visibly, the way a chess player recalibrates when he realizes the board is different from what he assumed. "It's done," Brad said. "I called Chicago." A beat of silence. "You had no authority." "I had Caruso's marker. 17 years old and never collected." Brad held his brother's gaze. "I collected it tonight. The debt is dissolved. The family's name is scrubbed from every ledger connected to Marcus Reyes. Chicago confirmed it 20 minutes ago. Call them." Vincent's jaw tightened. The 2 men behind him exchanged a glance. The wind came off the ridge and moved through the pines, and Rex sat at Brad's heel and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Vincent called. He listened. He hung up. He looked at Brad for a long moment. Not with anger, but with something sadder and more permanent than anger. Then he walked back to his truck. The headlights came on. All 3 vehicles turned and moved back down the access road and dissolved into the trailing dark, and Brad stood on the porch until the sound of the engines was completely gone, and there was nothing left but the wind and the weight of 17 years finally, irrevocably spent. He went back inside. Alice was standing at the end of the hallway, the baby against her chest, watching him. He didn't say it's over. It felt too large for words and too fragile to name just yet. He simply nodded. She closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in the way people close their eyes when they are finally, after a very long time, putting something down. Spring came the way it always does in that country, not announced but discovered. One morning the light through the kitchen window was different. Longer. It caught the dust motes differently, caught the grain of the wooden table, caught the silver in Alice's hair that Brad had not let himself notice before, because noticing felt like a liberty he hadn't yet earned. He was earning it now, slowly, the way you earn anything worth having. The children had changed in the way children change when safety becomes reliable rather than occasional, expanding into the space the fear had previously occupied. Daniel had opinions about the truck's engine now and voiced them without checking first to see if the room was safe for opinions. Maya had started drawing on everything, the windowsills, the margins of the grocery lists. Small, fierce animals that Brad found himself looking for each morning the way he used to check the perimeter. He found he preferred the drawings. The ring came off in April. Not dramatically, no ceremony, no announcement. He was washing his hands at the kitchen sink, and he simply slid it off and set it on the windowsill and left it there. Alice saw it that evening and said nothing, but she moved it gently to the shelf above the stove where the sage dish sat. Not discarded. Acknowledged. Filed under things that had shaped them both and no longer needed to be worn. They were not a love story in the way love stories announce themselves. There was no single moment, no declaration in the snow. It was quieter than that, accumulated, like the way a house absorbs the people living in it until their presence is in the walls. It was the way she left coffee for him before he was awake. The way he had learned, without being taught, the rhythm of the baby's evening fuss and how to walk the specific circuit of the living room that settled her. The way Rex had long ago stopped choosing between them at night, simply placing himself in the doorway between their rooms like a punctuation mark that refused to choose a sentence. One evening in late May, sitting on the porch while the children ran the yard and the last light came gold through the pines, Alice said quietly, "I think we're going to be all right." Brad watched Daniel chase Maya through the long grass, Rex bounding between them. The baby asleep against his chest in the carrier Alice had shown him how to fasten. "Yeah," he said. He'd stopped being surprised by the things that healed him. He had driven north to disappear. He had found, instead, the only thing that had ever made him worth finding. Some men spend their whole lives building empires out of fear and call it power. Brad had done exactly that. And it had taken a widow in a blizzard, 3 children, a newborn, and a dog with better instincts than he'd ever had, to show him what power actually looks like. It looks like a little girl drawing animals in the margins of grocery lists. It looks like a boy who has learned that the wind changes before the weather does. It looks like a woman burning sage at dawn because she knows that what the night leaves behind deserves to be cleared. It looks like starting over, even when starting over costs everything you thought you were. If the story moved you, if you found something of yourself in the snow, in the silence, in the long, slow work of becoming someone worth trusting, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We read every single one. And if you believe that broken things can be rebuilt into something stronger than they were before, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know whose blizzard you might be speaking into. Like, share and stay close because the next story is already waiting, and it begins, as the best ones always do, in the middle of the worst possible moment.